Hello.
Welcome back to the Space School. Like always, I'm PFW, your favorite hangout place. Today we're going to take a look into what would have happened had Darth Vader trained and raised Ezra Bridger to be his own apprentice. Given what we know about Ezra's abilities, would he make a formidable apprentice, or be nothing but a failure to Vader? Before we begin, this special thanks to our patrons, voice actors, and everyone else a part of the Pente Betrayal team. If you want a chance to win in our next giveaway, watch to the end of the video and I will tell you all about it. Our story begins 7 years after the fall of the Galactic Republic. The Empire has outstretched its evil arms across the galaxy, and the power vacuum of the galaxy was shrouded in darkness. With the Empire growing more and more powerful on the daily, the people of the galaxy lose more and more of their rights. On the planet far out of the reaches of the Outer Rim, there was a boy named Ezra Bridger. He had recently lost his parents, and he had to learn how to survive on his own. For a boy with reasonably caring parents, it was hard to imagine that he would ever find himself stealing or becoming a lowlife criminal to make ends meet. Luckily for Ezra, he lived in a tall structure on the outskirts of town. No one could find him and arrest him if he were to be chased for stealing. Not like anything he stole was of major importance anyways. By the time Ezra was 7, the Empire hadn't really cemented itself out here on Lothal. Just small patrols and a small garrison, nothing too important. The rebels weren't out here, and there was no real large organized group of rebels in the galaxy to begin with. The Empire was able to sustain its rule by putting down any incursions that arose during their rule literally anywhere. On Lothal, Ezra was living his daily life, which at this point was going out and stealing melee rooms and other types of food from local markets. He was a small boy, relatively short, but he used this to his advantage. Ezra had been alone for several months at this point, no parents coming home and no one to look after him, well, no one but himself. Ezra was able to find himself some food every day while dodging a group of imperial stormtroopers and other groups of people out and about. The benefit of having Imperials around the planet is that Ezra got lucky enough to steal from them, and he can make large profits from what he sold from them. The only issue was that Imperials happened to care if you stole from them, especially if they saw you steal from them. Well, a normal shopkeeper who wasn't really paying attention or wouldn't really notice, and other shopkeepers who noticed didn't really care or shout for officers, so stealing from an Imperial would be a bit different than that. Ezra's parents were pretty well known, and the fact that they disappeared leaving their only son behind meant that they knew Ezra would fend for himself. So most of the people that saw Ezra steal from them would just kind of let him get away with it, assuming that when he was old enough he would be able to give back to the community by working for people or even getting the Empire off of Lothal. But that was left to be determined for now. Ezra, over the past few weeks, was able to buy himself a speeder. He stole a small shipment of Imperial arms and sold it to some people across the plains of Lothal. It was a big heist for someone his age, and it resulted in his first real motive of transportation. It was a great victory for Ezra, because he was able to achieve it through hard work and dedication. Something that was installed by his parents, and something that would be a part of who he was as an individual at this point. With his speeder, Ezra was able to find himself a mode of transportation to the capital city, and a quick and easy escape route. Though with very little experience, and with legs barely long enough to even reach the clutch, he was a bit hard-pressed to find success with this new speeder. Months would continue to go by for Ezra as he found himself getting food and other little trinkets that were representative of his successes. He had himself a stormtrooper helmet that he stole, and it was one of his prized steals. Though one day, the ruse of Ezra Bridger was at an end. He tried to steal a small box shipment from a group of stormtroopers that appeared to not be paying attention. Within a moment's notice, Ezra was being lifted off the floor. He tried to run, but he was only 7, and a stormtrooper was, well, an adult. There was very little that Ezra would be able to do to escape this situation. As Ezra looked into the blank eyes of the stormtrooper, he saw that this would be the end of his chances at being a sly criminal. He was dragged by the stormtroopers into the Imperial garrison building. Ezra had never been captured before,
sorry,
and his heart was racing.
I know, I failed
He was a little
you.
nervous, a little scared, but the truth was, he didn't really know what was going to happen. He was seated down in an empty room as an Imperial officer walked in. He wasn't high-ranking, but he was the highest-ranked Imperial officer that Ezra had ever seen. The boy looked at the officer, who paced back and forth in the small room, demanding to know what Ezra was thinking. The boy refuted the Imperial officer by not saying a word to him, and just playing the silent game. The Imperial officer was rather annoyed by this as he continued trying to pry at Ezra, getting nothing in result. He told Ezra that if he didn't give him what he stole, he would be killed. Ezra still didn't break. Instead of getting upset, he asked what the boy's name was, with a quick rebuttal of the name Jabba the Hutt. The officer chuckled. This was an obvious that Jabba had lost some weight. So, instead of being brutal to the boy, he made an offer. The Imperial officer saw potential in Ezra, so he told Ezra that because of his decision to be quiet and stubborn, then he would have an opportunity to choose. Ezra could remain on Lothal, struggle for his life, and scavenge every day until he was old enough to be arrested full-time and for good, or Ezra could be sent to an Imperial outpost, where he would be able to choose a role in either the Imperial infantry or the Imperial Navy, where he could become a pilot, officer, or even deck commander. Ezra looked at the officer. He didn't care for the Empire too much, but he really didn't care for much in general at this point. So, why not take the opportunity? He could become a pilot, make enough in a couple years, and retire, leave the military, and have the ability to live on his own without having to worry about stealing Melly runes. So, Ezra told the officer that he would be willing to join the Empire. The officer smiled, and Ezra would be off to the first Imperial Gazante cruiser off-world. Ezra would be most likely sent to Coruscant. If a recruit was being sent away from a planet's garrison, it was because the lead officer believed the recruit would be good enough for an Imperial program on Coruscant, with the best of the best, rather than a low-life garrison out in the Outer Rim. Ezra was on a journey to the capital planet in the galaxy. Coruscant would be the place he would become the man he was meant to grow into. On Coruscant, there were two men, shrouded in darkness, as they looked over the city of Coruscant. One wore all white, and the other wore all black with a hood over his head. They were talking about plans for the future of this great empire, and the one in all white was making a proposal to the one in black. He wanted to begin his test program towards a new type of starfighter. While it would be expensive, the Emperor decided that Thrawn could begin to have his prototypes be put into construction for the TIE Defender program. If he was able to get the TIE Defender operational and provide a good test for it, then the Empire might be able to mass produce them. If not, it would be scrapped and that would be the end of it. Regardless, elsewhere on the planet there was an even darker eminence. Instead of the Imperial garrison facility, there was a dark metallic creature. He was in there to train a new group of inquisitors. These inquisitors were meant to do all the dirty work for the Empire. With the Grand Inquisitor as their leader, the Inquisitorius was a group of former Jedi who converted to the dark side of the Force. The only issue is that they were not extremely powerful with the Force. They were rather weak, and they provided to be very little competition against any of the surviving Jedi in the galaxy. For Vader, he loathed training them, but it was his mission, and it was what he was instructed to do, based on what his master demanded. Vader would go not easy on them. He would never be easy with them. He saw them almost like little rivals, people who were no match to the power of the dark side that lived within him. So, when Vader trained the Inquisitors, he beat up on them. He made sure that they understood true suffering, cutting off their limbs and making sure they rued the day that they ever survived the Purge, let alone make them regret the day they ever decided to try and turn to the dark side of the Force to be a part of the Inquisitorius. Vader finished his training and confronted the Grand Inquisitor. Vader was clearly disappointed by the outcome of the training. The Grand Inquisitor waited for a blasting. It wasn't his fault, but his students were essentially useless. They were only good enough to kill former Padawans and really nothing more. They mostly struggled against knights and they weren't allowed near Jedi Masters. An essentially useless group of individuals. They did the work that a group of stormtroopers could do, and the stormtroopers were even more effective than them. Vader looked at the Grand Inquisitor as he towered over the leader of the Inquisitorius, saying to him,
"They disappoint me yet again. They are useless."
Lord Vader, they need more time. Soon they will be what the Emperor desires.
You are fortunate that the Emperor wants a group of Inquisitors.
They will be able to take the pressure off of you. I can assure you that.
You better hope. What is that?
What is what, my lord?
A strong presence within.
Darth Vader turned around and began walking off. The Grand Inquisitor was curious to see where this went, as he followed the Dark Lord of the Sith, not fully aware of what Vader was catching on to. Vader walked into a hallway and saw an Imperial officer walking with a small boy wearing an orange outfit. Vader raised his hand and then pulled a small key from the officer's uniform to see what quadrant he was from.
Lothal? What would you be doing out here from Lothal? My lord, I was bringing this boy here, and I believe he would be great for the Imperial Academy. Leave him to me. Yes, my lord.
Darth Vader towered over Ezra as he looked down at him. The boy didn't hesitate when he saw Vader. He just looked up. Vader was honestly quite impressed by the boy's ability to stand his ground, especially when there were grown men who would cower at the sight of Vader, let alone standing face to face with the Dark Lord of the Sith. Ezra was not afraid, but something was even more alluring to Vader. The boy was extremely powerful within the Force. Vader knew this. He could feel the Force flowing through Ezra. Something about this boy was interesting to Vader. He wasn't sure of what to make of it, but something was bringing him to Ezra. The boy had a natural affinity to the Force, and that affinity could make him a powerful ally to Vader. Vader asked the boy,
"What is your name, boy?"
Jabba the Hutt.
Listen, boy. Be more.
Silence, Grand Inquisitor. Listen to me, boy. You can either become more than what you could possibly believe, or you can be stuck as an Imperial pilot with nothing more than an impossible dream to ever become something. Answer wisely.
Fine. My name is Ezra Bridger.
Good. The Force is powerful with you. Do you know that?
Look, I don't know what the Force is. All I know is that one guy thought it would be a good idea to drag me across the galaxy to be here.
Then the Force has brought you to me. I will train you. You will be what the Inquisitorius will not.
Lord Vader?
The Emperor is not to know of this.
The Grand Inquisitor nodded his head as Vader stepped forward, placing his hand on Ezra's shoulder and guiding him away. The two would walk in silence to a shuttle that would take Vader to his personal Star Destroyer. Vader had spent the last 7 years cementing himself on the dark side of the Force, but the possibility of training this boy to possibly kill the Emperor would be pleasant. Vader never had any excitement towards overthrowing his master, especially because anyone with any power was either missing or dead. Asajj Ventress would have been a great student, but rumor had it she died before the end of the Clone Wars, and Maul, on the other hand, would have been somewhat to assist Vader, but he disappeared at the end of the Clone Wars, with the apparent death of the apprentice. Vader had no issue with not having someone. He eventually thought he could kill the Emperor on his own, but that time was very clearly not now. On board of Vader's personal flagship, he would assign Ezra a room, and he would bring Ezra to the main hangar bay, clearing out the hangar bay and ensuring that no one was around. Vader demanded that Ezra stand with him. Without saying a word, Vader would lift objects with the Force and move them around. They got bigger and bigger, as Vader then began lifting every single object in the room with little to no hesitation. Ezra's mouth hung wide open. It dropped to the floor as he watched the immaculate power of Vader. The Dark Lord of the Sith then turned around and faced Ezra.
Are you ready to begin your training?
How did you do that? I don't understand.
The dark side of the Force is a pathway to many abilities, Ezra.
I guess I'm ready.
The training for Ezra would begin. It would be simplistic at first. For Vader, it took him back to the days at the Jedi Temple. Of course, Vader was still in his most raw and evil form, but part of this training with Ezra made him remember the memories he never wanted to think about again. The basic training Ezra had to go through to even conceptualize what the Force was very rudimentary, to say the least. But it had to be done, especially because if it wasn't, it would mean that Vader would struggle trying to train someone who had not the slightest clue of what the Force was or how to use it. The beginning was showing Ezra how to trust the Force, and for Vader, this was the most basic and yet calming step in Ezra's training. It took Vader back in his memory, a moment in time. He thought it was just like he was Anakin Skywalker again. He was sitting in the council chambers, a tear rolled down his cheek. He couldn't help but think of what pain and misery of losing Padme and their one child would be like. Of course, Vader knew that feeling, but in the memory of Anakin, thought about what it would be like to raise that child and care for that child and teach that child in the ways of the Force. While Vader didn't know about Luke or Leia, either than being born, he did know that training Ezra replaced a hole in his own chest. Training Ezra is exactly what Anakin imagined raising his and Padme's child would be like. It was both heart-wrenching and uplifting, because Vader for the very first time was able to feel love in some way, shape, or form towards somebody. Ezra became almost like a son for Vader, and as the basics of training continued into completion after months, Vader viewed Ezra as if he were his son, without really even mentioning it or even acknowledging it himself. This emotional bond left a profound effect on Vader. He now believed he had a reason to exist through all of this torment. He now had a purpose, and he now had his own apprentice, and in that apprentice, he had a son-like figure at least. The bond that was created between Ezra and Vader was very profound. They both lost something of importance, and because of that lack of person or persons in their life, they found reliance in one another. It didn't mean that Vader was on the light, or Ezra was turning to the light, or either or, but it did mean that Vader did treat Ezra like his own, and to the same extent, Ezra saw Vader like his father. The difference for the two is that Vader never met his child, but Ezra knew his parents. But without parents, Ezra could have ended up doing numerous amounts of wronging. Rather, he was now on a path to what he was now seeing as justice. Because Ezra was so young, he was extremely impressionable, and Vader was able to take advantage of that, as he taught Ezra all about the evil of the Emperor, and how in due time the two of them would rise up and kill him together. But until that time, Ezra would learn the ways of the Sith, and once he was ready, he would adopt his own lightsaber. Ezra was extremely interested in lightsabers, and every time he got the opportunity, he would steal Vader's blade and play with it, or train with it, however you want to see it. While Vader didn't acknowledge it or acted like he didn't notice, the few times that he did, he realized that it would be eventually time for Ezra to train with a lightsaber. If he didn't, it would be a crime to Ezra's growth, and Vader, he knew all about being held back by somebody else. For a Sith, it would be different than just finding a kyber crystal and calling it your own. For a Sith, and for Ezra, it would have to be to find and kill a Jedi for their crystal and bleed it. And while Ezra was young, he knew that the boy would be up for the challenge. Vader would wait until an Imperial officer gave him the whereabouts of a Jedi Master, and that would be the first place Vader would take his new student. Ezra would be lucky enough to have a master like Vader, because if he didn't, he would have to face this Jedi Master all alone. Though there would be an even more of a challenge for Ezra. While the first few months of basic training showed Vader that he had a child in his hands that would be as powerful as someone that was born by Padme, he did realize that if he wanted to exploit that power, he had to continue to let Ezra flourish. So, that's what Vader did. By the time Ezra was joining Vader, he was powerful enough to use Force Choke and even the slightest bit of Force Lightning. Vader never taught Ezra about Force Lightning. Rather, he learned it from some spare Sith holocrons laying around. The boy had a great level of motivation, and with that motivation he found himself a way to learn even without his master being around. Sidious, on the other hand, hadn't picked up on any of this. Vader didn't make it apparent that he cared for anybody, and he was still very tough on Ezra, so it never really appeared through the Force that Vader was changing his ways. Ezra saw Vader's training as an honor. His fragile mind was becoming warped and even more twisted into darkness. The time came for Ezra to depart on his first mission with Vader. The Dark Lord was very interested in the kind of apprentice he could have if Ezra was allowed to grow with the power of a lightsaber. The possibilities were endless, so the two went in a shuttle down to a planet. It was a hidden planet, out of sight from the Empire, but it did house a former Jedi temple. Vader checked all the former Jedi temples, and he never found any Jedi within them. So, here on Dantooine, he had the opportunity to rectify those wrongs. The presence here was that of multiple Jedi, but Vader didn't know if they were weak or strong. He just could feel that they were here. Vader decided that this battle would be allowing Ezra to use his blade, and Vader, on the other hand, would just use the dark side of the Force to embolden himself in combat. Of course, this wasn't the way of the Sith, but this was the closest thing to a son that Vader had, so he gave him a chance to use his lightsaber against the Jedi. The Imperial officer blabbered the name of the Jedi who were here, but Vader didn't really care. He always relished in his ability to slaughter Jedi. The shuttle landed and he could feel their terror. Vader grinned under the mask as he looked at Ezra and spoke to him.
Do you feel that, Ezra?
Yes, Master.
It is fear. The Jedi fear us. Relish in it. Let it give you power.
So we thrive off of their fear?
Yes, my apprentice. Use this.
Are you sure you want me to use your lightsaber?
I will use the Force. Soon, you will be able to wield this power too.
Ezra looked down at the hilt of his father, his master's blade. He twisted the hilt as the shuttle ramp opened down, and the massive caped man walked down. Ezra followed his master quickly. Vader walked down into the rain as pelts began bouncing off of his helmet and down into his robes. Ezra followed as his red and black outfit began to get covered in rain too. Ezra saw Vader like a true father, and followed him down the ramp as they made their way for the abandoned Jedi Temple. Vader used the Force to guide him to where the Jedi might be. When they entered the ruins of the temple, water could be heard trickling down into the destroyed ruins. Vader could feel the Jedi. They were so close. Vader then looked down at Ezra as rain dripped off of his mask. Ezra looked up at the towering man, and then looked around and closed his eyes. He raised his hand and felt back and forth as he looked for the source of terror in the air. He knew exactly what Vader wanted, without even having to hear a request. Their bond was extremely tight, and at this point they could have essentially been inside of each other's minds. Vader grinned, obviously under the mask, as Ezra landed his target on a room far down the ways. Ezra looked up at his master and nodded. Vader gestured forward as Ezra led the way to where he felt the fear coming from. Vader followed behind as his boots echoed throughout the hallway. Vader's breathing could be heard as they walked into the room. It was very dimly lit. Vader reached his hand out, and a small child came flying through the wall. Vader threw the child on the floor. They were not much older than Ezra. They would have been a youngling inside of the Jedi Temple during Order 66. Vader looked at Ezra, and then to the child. Ezra didn't need to hear Vader tell him to kill her, so, without a second of hesitation, Ezra ignited his lightsaber, as she looked up at him, her hair covering tears behind her eyes, and her starved body showed that she, and wherever the rest of her brethren were just struggling to get by. Ezra gritted his teeth as he jabbed at her, killing the Jedi Padawan immediately. Vader could feel Ezra's hesitation, but he didn't have time to acknowledge it as the sound of 5 different lightsabers ignited across the room. Vader looked up at Ezra, and the two of them readied themselves. Vader wasn't worried about Ezra. He'd seen Ezra use his own lightsaber before, and he never really made Ezra aware of his knowledge of him using his lightsaber. Rain could be heard picking up outside of the ruins as an older Jedi Master with a nearly white blade stepped forward. He stood in front of the other Jedi. There was a knight, and the rest of them were all former younglings, all of them too young to be anything more than that. Vader didn't move as Tara Sinube stepped forward. Ezra watched as the younger one closest to him jumped at him with their blade open. Ezra was quick to deflect as he moved into an attack position. No real lightsaber training or form under his belt. Vader turned away from Ezra, assuming he would be able to handle this fight alone. The Jedi Knight ran at Vader with rage and anger, as Vader used the Force to stop him in his tracks, pulling the Jedi's lightsaber around to his shoulder. Vader pressed the blade further as it cut into the robes and then into the skin of the Jedi Knight. The 2 youngling-aged Jedi ran forward at Vader in an attempt to save the Jedi that saved them from the Jedi Temple during Operation Nightfall, though these 2 Jedi would not survive another attempt from Vader. A saddened no rang out of Sinube's mouth, but it was too late as the 2 Padawans were lifted up from the ground as they were thrown to opposing sides of the room. Vader focused on the knight in front of him as he heard Ezra cry out. He jabbed a lightsaber in the arm of the Jedi and turned around. Vader looked at Ezra, who noticed that Vader was looking at him. He then pushed back as Vader turned around, looking at the 4 Jedi as Master Sinube tried to make a push. Vader waved him off as he threw the old Jedi Master away to the side. Vader then focused on the 3 Jedi as he pulled the 2 Padawans from opposing sides of the room, while the Jedi Knight's lightsaber was lodged in the arm of the Jedi Knight. The man screamed out in pain, and he watched the 2 Padawans point their blades at one another, as Vader brought the 2 of them towards one another as their blades passed through the other. The knight cried out as Vader stepped forward, releasing the 2 lifeless Padawans as they fell to the floor. Vader grinned under the mask as he walked up to the Jedi Knight, using the Force again as he shoved the knight's blade through his own body. As the knight fell helplessly to the floor, Vader turned around as he watched Ezra. At the same time, Vader pulled Master Sanube from the floor. The Jedi Master's lightsaber cane fell to the floor as he was raised into the air. Ezra beat back the Padawan as he tried his best, still several years younger than the Padawan. Vader pulled Sanube into his hand as he wrapped his metallic hand around the fragile neck of the ancient Jedi Master. Sanube coughed as he tried to get the attention of the Padawan, trying to get them to run away. But the Padawan saw Sanube, and when their attention left the duel with Ezra, they were killed immediately. Ezra turned and looked at Vader, and at the Jedi that Vader was holding. Sanube tried to say something, say anything, but the strength of the metallic grip choked the air out of the former Jedi Master. Vader said,
"This is the end for you, Master Sanube,"
and then crushed the windpipe of the Jedi Master. Vader contacted the Grand Inquisitor over communications. They weren't too far from the Mustafar system, so it wouldn't be too long for the Inquisitors to claim their prize.
"Grand Inquisitor,
Yes, my lord?
Terra Sanube is here on Dantooine. If you want him for your prize collection, he is located here, inside."
Thank you, Lord Vader. Second sister, go to Dantooine and collect the...
Vader turned off the communications. He looked down at Ezra, and then he held out his hand as his apprentice placed his master's blade into the metallic hand.
"You did well, Ezra. Now, grab the lightsaber of that Padawan.
Yes, Master.
You will learn how to bleed this blade, and your journey to the dark side will truly begin.
Where will we go now, Master?
We will return to my castle on Mustafar. There, you will become a true Sith Lord."
I look forward to learning from you, Father. I meant Master.
Vader looked at Ezra and then ignored the awkwardness of the situation as he placed his hand on Ezra's shoulder and guided the boy forward and out of the temple. Vader sat quietly in his mind. The word father dragged out over and over again, echoing in his mind. Ezra, on the other hand, began to stress. He was afraid that Vader might kill him for having said that to him, but instead, it took Vader to an emotional state of mind. For the first time, he was ever referred to as a father. He didn't know whether to be enraged or to genuinely be happy. Vader sat down inside of the shuttle. Nothing but the sound of his breathing could be heard. Memories shot through his mind, but these weren't memories. These were dreams he had during his time in Bacta after losing to Kenobi. He saw Padme and their son or daughter, depending on the dream, in the fields of Naboo, the same place where Padme and Anakin fell in love. It was beautiful. It was an amazing dream. It was also the remnants of Anakin Skywalker that died with it when it ended. Ezra sat on the other side of the ship, in almost complete terror. He was afraid Vader would snap his neck, and that would just be the end of him. Ezra genuinely liked Vader, and while he never saw his face, and Vader was hard on him, Vader came into Ezra's life and took him under his wing, treated him well enough to show him how to grow. Ezra looked at his lightsaber and twisted it in his hand, nervously, waiting for Vader to say something. Ezra didn't realize he was holding the edge of the hilt towards his face, and as he accidentally turned the blade, Vader reached out before the sound or the movement could be made and froze the blade before it cut through Ezra's face. Vader looked at Ezra, and Ezra at Vader. As Ezra held his hand over his chest, his heart spiking out of his chest. Vader lowered the blade and turned it off with the Force, and then he looked at Ezra. Vader knew something needed to be said, but he didn't know what to say. But if there's any time for him to be saying something, now was the time for him to say it.
"Ezra, did you mean that?"
I mean, yes?
"Come, sit here.
I hope you're not mad at me. I didn't mean anything.
No need to fret, Ezra.
Ezra moved over and sat next to Vader.
I too lost someone important to me, Ezra. I find that through our bond as master and apprentice, we've become more familial."
Vader paused for a long moment, and then said the words,
"There isn't any reason for me to believe that this bond between us will not make us stronger, so for that, you may refer to me as such, if you wish."
I am truly sorry. It slipped out, but you've been a father to me, and I can't express how much I appreciate it.
I understand more than you know.
Ezra leaned up next to Vader as the two of them waited to dock inside of the Star Destroyer above the planet. The two would walk to the bridge. No one on Vader's ship talked outside of this about his apprentice. The ship would depart for Mustafar, where Vader would take his new apprentice to begin his real training. As they got to Mustafar, the training would begin to intensify. As the two acknowledged their bond with one another, they realized what it meant to have something that was gone. It drove them further down the path of darkness because they could trust each other more and more. Their bond as a father and son, it could not be broken. They were dedicated to each other, and Vader was dedicated to establishing a legacy through Ezra as his son. Their training on Mustafar would begin with the bleeding of a lightsaber crystal, from a blue blade into a crimson one. Ezra would struggle with this, as the dark side, much like for Vader, was very natural to him. Ezra would be able to take up living on Mustafar really easily, on the other hand, and then, after struggling to begin with, he would excel. It wouldn't be more than a couple of years until Ezra was climbing closer and closer to Vader's power. He had so much raw potential, and a lot of it was untapped, as he grew exceptionally fast. During those years, he would spend every waking moment on Mustafar, taking apart the holocrons of the Sith, and eventually fueling a new hatred for a Jedi by the name of Obi-Wan Kenobi. During these couple years on Mustafar, Vader would lose to the Jedi Master. This did two things for Ezra. It showed him that Vader was not truly invincible, and it also taught him to hate the Jedi more than he already did. Ezra was impressionable, as it was, but as he grew, he became confident in himself. He took up an aggressive lightsaber form. Ezra was also a very powerful Force user. He took advantage of Vader's teachings, and by the time he was 13, he was an unsavory match for most to find themselves running into. Still being a secret to Palpatine, it was time for Ezra to venture out into the galaxy. Vader had plans, and for those plans to be accomplished, it was time for Ezra to go to the ancient worlds of the Sith, to achieve powers of the Ancient Ones. They would need it for the battle with the Dark Lord of the Sith, otherwise known as Sidious. Of course, Sidious wasn't entirely in the dark here. He could feel the rising talent in the dark side, and it clearly wasn't Vader or the Grand Inquisitor. On the other hand, the Grand Inquisitor stayed relatively loyal to Vader, without revealing the truth of his secret apprentice. He assumed it would mean that he would have more passageway into whichever regime Vader established in a realm without the Emperor of the Empire. Vader knew that he would be able to establish a reign of imperial power all by himself, but until he needed Ezra to reach his full potential with the guidance of the Sith. Until then, Ezra would find himself on Korriban, Kryus II, and Malachor V. As Ezra visited each planet, months would pass by. The boy was infatuated with the idea of the Sith, and learning from their holocrons and exploiting them for power. As Ezra learned about the ancient Sith on Korriban and Kryus II, he eventually, after one full year of travel, would find himself on Malachor V. On Malachor V, Ezra would feel the presence in the Force. That presence was one that was new, a hidden, old, and decrepit life form, one who he would come to know as Maul. While it would be easy for Maul to die at Ezra's hands, Ezra had a better idea. Maul, who would try and corrupt Ezra, would only come to realize that the young Sith was already more powerful than him. No matter how much he hated the idea of it, Maul was getting older, and hadn't had a duel since Mandalore, almost 14 years beforehand. If anything, he was at this point Ezra's apprentice. But for Maul, one thing was more true than anything else. He just wanted a companion, someone who could travel the galaxy with in hopes of revenge against his former master. Ezra was hopes for that revenge, but little did Maul realize that there was already a chance for that revenge with Ezra. Though for Maul, he would come to realize that the one named Skywalker, the one he tried to have killed 14 years ago, would be the leader of this operation. Maul would have no reason to try and convince Ezra because, if he did, he would probably face his wrath. Instead, Maul was brought back to Mustafar after Ezra got what he came for, a Sith holocron, one that could bestow him with great powers. As much as Maul wanted to use this holocron, it was only for Vader and Ezra to use. They were the only two Sith, no one else. While Ezra assumed Vader would be happy to have aid against Sidious, it wasn't exactly true. Maul wasn't exactly the type of aid that Vader wanted. But after a year of not seeing his son, he was truly grateful to have him back. But it was time for them to begin the downfall of Sidious. So, Vader ensured that he would have everyone ready to kill the Emperor. Instead of making the group of Sith travel to Sidious, it would be easiest if he requested Sidious to Mustafar for assistance with a Sith teaching, something Sidious would most likely revel in. Regardless, Sidious would be called in and would to Mustafar. It would take time, so while Vader and the others waited, they prepared a trap. The Grand Inquisitor waited idly. He was loyal to the Emperor, but he decided he would turn against Vader. He was close to Vader, and with 3 others here to kill the Emperor, there was little chance that they would fail. So Vader waited until his master shuttle arrived on the landing platform of his castle. Vader didn't have anything to say to his master, and neither did Sidious to his apprentice. They both knew why Sidious was here. He took Sidious down into the cavern under his castle. There stood an altar to the Sith. So, Vader motioned Sidious towards the altar, and then as soon as Sidious passed his apprentice, Vader ignited his lightsaber. Sidious instantaneously turned around to look at Vader.
Lord Vader? What are you?
Your rule is at an end.
So you think.
From the corners of the cave, 3 other lightsabers ignited, as Sidious soon realized this wasn't a fight with Vader alone. The faces of these Sith were hidden behind their crimson blades, as Sidious whipped out his lightsaber with a growl as he twisted his body towards Vader. The Dark Lord was quick to deflect and react as he pushed Sidious back. Ezra leaped across the air as he spun, kicked, and then pulled his lightsaber around as Sidious rebounded and connected blades with Ezra. As Maul, with seething anger, jumped in to attack Sidious. The shock of seeing Maul threw Sidious a little bit off balance, as he stepped side to side, only to meet blades with the Grand Inquisitor, who then threw him off again. Sidious was powerful, but it had been 14 years as well since his last duel. He toiled back and forth as he met blades with Vader, and then the Grand Inquisitor. Ezra pushed forward as he threw Sidious back a bit, and then Maul spun around, as his ancient blade cut through the torso of the Sith Lord. As Sidious fell back into Vader's blade, all the Sith looked at each other, silently, and then watched the lifeless Sidious fall to the floor. Vader stormed off as he pulled the lightsaber of the deceased Sith Lord to his hilt. The other 3 looked at each other as Maul, with his lightsaber still lit, began stabbing at Sidious, trying to get out all of his rage. But after years of suffering because of the Sith Lord, the rage wouldn't be fulfilled. So many years of suffering, and only a few seconds of relief would never make the years go away. Maul looked down and cried out as Ezra and the Grand Inquisitor moved themselves to follow in Vader's footsteps. Vader was seated in his throne room when the 2 arrived. He was talking to a couple of imperial moths, informing them of the change within the Empire, and the change that the Empire would see. Ezra and the Grand Inquisitor waited quietly. They wanted to make sure that when the Emperor was ready to give orders, they would be prepared. Vader was their new Emperor. The fate of Maul, on the other hand, hadn't been decided yet, but as long as he remained loyal to the Empire, it didn't really matter to Vader. Maul could go out and about, and he would have a place to stay as an enforcer within the Empire. The Empire had very little rebel insurgents, and while they still were small, they also had to be dealt with. If Vader sent Maul out, he would need to obey the orders that Vader gave him, but that was to be determined. Maul had spent a couple years rummaging around Malachor V, just like he had been for the 10 years after he lost his first duel to Kenobi. As obvious as it was that Kenobi was a common enemy, as much as Sidious was, Kenobi couldn't get in the way of running this new empire. As soon as Vader finished with the moths, he looked up and rested his arms on his seat. Vader moved his head around and looked at both of them. The Grand Inquisitor spoke first.
Lord Vader, what is thy bidding?
I want you to kill the Inquisitors.
All of them, my lord?
Did I stutter?
It will be done.
Ezra, you will go out and destroy the rebels.
Within hours, the Grand Inquisitor and Ezra were out across the galaxy. Maul stumbled into the throne room as he fell on the ground, looking exhausted as ever. Vader only acknowledged him momentarily before going back into his silence. Vader set up an imperial high-ranking structure to be loyal to him and him alone. He knew which imperials would be loyal to him and which ones should be killed. Vader allowed Maul to remain dormant in his throne room for a short while, before demanding that Maul take an Imperial Star Destroyer out to the Mid-Rim and find what rebels he could and kill them. Maul would be giving numerous amounts of troops to accomplish his missions, as long as he stayed loyal to the Emperor. Maul was smart and manipulative, and he always wanted power, but now, at his age, it wasn't worth his time to try and kill Vader. He knew it would be a useless attempt, futile in the fullest, so instead he would allow Ezra to do his dirty work, if that would be the case, assuming that Vader and Ezra followed the rule of two, which was apparent that they did not. Judging by the relationship that Ezra and Vader had, there was no indication that either of them would ever try to kill the other. Even more so, there was the Grand Inquisitor. He would be loyal to Vader. He had to prove himself first. He needed to kill the entire Inquisitorius. If he could do that, then he would be allowed to stay in the Empire. The Grand Inquisitor knew that this would be a challenge, but certainly not one that he wouldn't be able to complete. He just needed to kill them all separately, and then that would be the deed done. Of course, he didn't want to, but if he had the chance to choose between him and them, he would certainly spare himself. And as for Ezra, he would have no reason to doubt his trust for his master. Vader was the teacher Ezra wanted, and the teacher he needed. Of course, father and son bond between Ezra and Vader was very strong. It also made Ezra feel a bit of assurance for himself. The stage was set, as the Empire grew stronger in terms of militaristic strength. But the Imperial Senate didn't react well to an Emperor Vader, so someone needed to be placed in command to mediate the crowds, a man who would be loyal to every which end, Director Krennic. He would be enough to stabilize the Senate, but he was also loyal enough where he would protect the best interests of Lord Vader. Of course, Tarkin, Yularen, and maybe even Thrawn would be a good choice as well, but Krennic had a tight leash naturally, so it would be better for him to be watched under Vader's control. As the Imperial Senate would change and begin to take rule from the new Counselor, as he was referred to, the galaxy would come to see Vader and Krennic as two leading powers. The Empire began to stretch its arms out further into the galaxy, and the galaxy itself would face the wrath of Maul and Ezra until the Grand Inquisitor was ready to also go out and serve the Empire, after dispatching the rest of the Inquisitorius. Maul would find himself on a backwater world, where he would be searching for one of the most infamous rebel insurgents known to frequent the area. Maul was an expert at killing and finding whoever it was he was trying to kill. As he waited in the forests of the small moon, he found a group of insurgents in the middle of the night. Only the screams of pain and death would echo at the end of Saw Gerrera and his band of terrorists. As for Ezra, he was also out in the middle of nowhere, traveling with an Imperial light cruiser. He wanted his presence to be as small as possible, as he searched for Jedi or for rebels. Whichever he would find would be the best for him to kill. On this planet, he was trailing a duo of rebels that were also kind of like smugglers. One was a younger man, and the other one was a Twi'lek. Ezra didn't take too much of a dig deep into it, as he found time to make an example of these two. The only issue is that one of them happened to be a Jedi Padawan. When Ezra made his presence known, he was faced with a Jedi who ignited a put-together lightsaber. A short and simple duel would begin, but the power of the boy was much more than anything that this Kanan Jarrus could ever dream of. Ezra slashed through the Jedi Knight, killing him only after a short confrontation, after which he would kill the pilot of the ghost ship called Hera Syndulla. At this point, their crew was just the two of them, and their death would be quick and simple. Nothing too elongated, but their bodies would be faced with public humiliation, as they were left to hang in the town square, as an example to rebellion or to crime. The next 5 years would see similar resolutions. The Empire would continue to grow in power, with a new structure being completed, called the Death Star. While Vader never liked the project and never even wanted it to see the light of day, he allowed its completion because it was costly and it was already mostly complete by the time Vader became Emperor of the galaxy. At which point he just assumed he might as well let The teams and crews finish the construction and move on and work on other Imperial projects afterwards. For Vader, his empire had almost no competition. There was only a slight issue of Obi-Wan Kenobi and Yoda having never been found. Of course, by this point, they both could have been dead, but it was unlikely. Vader had his own personal throne room inside of the Death Star, but he always preferred his castle. At this point, Ezra was reaching his maximum power, something that the late Anakin Skywalker would have dreamt of achieving. Maul and the Grand Inquisitor both had their own feelings toward this new reign of Vader, but they weren't negative. They both trusted in Vader's leadership, and they believed in his power. The rebels were spread out even more thinly across the galaxy, but there was a tiny bit of hope. There was a light rising in the galaxy, and that light was coming to face Vader. Of course, Vader knew it, and he could feel the light growing. Assuming that the Jedi were back, he prepared Ezra, Maul, and the Grand Inquisitor for the possibility of an insurrection to their power. Vader knew, just as well as the Grand Inquisitor did, that the best way to lure a Jedi in was to give them a chance at justice, something that gave them an idealistic feeling towards hope and whatnot. Or, just as the Grand Inquisitor would put it, the Jedi Code was like an itch, so naturally the Sith prepared a trap, something that would lure this increasing light in, so that they could snuff it out and continue their rule without competition or without struggle. There was absolutely no one in the galaxy who would stand up to the might of the Empire, and within weeks of preparation for their trap, it was set, and everything was ready into action. It would also involve a similar tactic used by the former Third Sister, something that would draw in Kenobi, at the very least. Without having much of a reason to do it otherwise, Leia Organa would be captured from her homeworld of Alderaan and brought to the Death Star. There would be no intention to kill her, yet, especially since she was a rebel and she was very low-key about it, but they didn't know, and no one in the galaxy really knew that she was a rebel. The fact that she could draw out a hermit from his cage for the first time in several years only proved that she would be useful in the future to do it again. It just so happened that the future was now. It wouldn't take long, but a group of bounty hunters would show up on Alderaan and capture the princess of the planet. She was royalty, and it would be a big deal if the Empire did it, so she was captured by bounty hunters. She would then be brought to the Death Star, where she would be prisoner, with an obvious detail left behind for Bail Organa to find, telling him where she was gone to. It wouldn't take much longer for a cargo ship carrying Obi-Wan Kenobi and a much younger boy to be found on board the Death Star, both of them wielding a lightsaber. It was apparent that Luke Skywalker had been trained in the ways of the Force for not longer than a month. But it was also very obvious that the only capable duelist on board the ship was Obi-Wan Kenobi. The aging old man was decrepit, but the rising light in the galaxy was also present, and that was the main goal of this operation, to drag the light away from the Jedi and suffocate them. During the time Luke and Ben had before getting onto the Death Star, it was important for Ben to fill Luke in on all the information regarding his lineage. It didn't really matter, because all that mattered at this point was the fact that they needed to save Leia from the Empire. If they didn't, her chances of survival were very unlikely. Luke was aware of his father and who he was, but he didn't know Vader was on the Death Star, and neither did Obi-Wan. The entire setup seemed too good to be true, but the Jedi rushed in. It was evident that they needed to save Leia, and so Luke and Obi-Wan split up inside of the prison wing, despite their better judgment. Vader awaited for Kenobi. Of course he could let Maul or the Grand Inquisitor deal with that, but of course he would never let that happen. Vader wanted to kill Kenobi himself. It would be a tiresome duel, but it would be one of the final exact revenges on Vader's hand. At the same time, the Grand Inquisitor and Maul would be out and about looking to capture the other Jedi that was seen exiting the ship. If they could capture that Jedi, bring him before Vader, there was a good chance that Vader would be able to exterminate the Jedi, assuming that the rest of them were dead throughout the galaxy. Maul and the Grand Inquisitor traveled as a pack, while at the same time Ezra was nowhere to be seen. He felt a disturbance in the Force, and he quieted his mind where he was. He was concealed from all, as he hid his Force essence, and even from his father. Simultaneously, Vader and his opponent, Obi-Wan, were traversing the west wing of the prison block. Luke was on the other side, on the north edge of the prison block. Vader would not be hesitant in this duel. 10 years of waiting for revenge against this Obi-Wan Kenobi, and it would be excellent. It'd be sweet. Vader ignited his blade as he patiently moved towards Kenobi, who waited at the end of the other side of the hallway. Of course, for Vader, there was a bit of hesitance, because of the last two times these two met. Obi-Wan made Vader look like a fool and feel like a fool every time they met with each other. Kenobi was quick to reciprocate Vader's movements, as he ignited his own lightsaber and prepared for combat against the Dark Lord of the Sith. Red and blue cascaded down the hallways as they met in the middle, with the roar of lightsabers as the former master and apprentice dueled one final time to the death. Obi-Wan and Vader again, showing the truest test of their skill as they bounced back and forth. The sound of lightsabers outside of Leia's cell awoke her to the presence of Kenobi. She was obviously rooting for the man that saved her from the Inquisitors so many years ago, but Obi-Wan wasn't young or vibrant anymore. He was rather old and rattled, and while age never determined one's skill or grit, it did make a difference in this confrontation against Vader. The Dark Lord didn't hold back as he cut through cells and walls alike, pushing Kenobi back through the corridor. Vader was unhinged and his power was ultimate. As a machine, he had undeniable strength, with not just a lightsaber but with each and every swing he took. Kenobi struck at Vader's armor, and Vader outraged as he swung back and he hit Kenobi off of his feet. Obi-Wan knew he had a chance to do something to stop Vader, but that wasn't going to be through him, rather his children. Obi-Wan remembered back to when Padme said that there was still good in Anakin. Maybe it was possible, but even that was a long shot based off of what Vader told him all those years ago. Kenobi tried to talk, but before he could, Vader had no reason to listen to him, so he twisted his blade down, and the body of Kenobi vanished into thin air. Vader was very disappointed that Kenobi just disappeared, but then he was distracted when the Grand Inquisitor requested him to the throne room, where a boy by the name of Luke Skywalker awaited, the apparent son of Darth Vader. So, when Vader turned around, he pulled Kenobi's lightsaber with the Force as he prepared to meet this boy who claimed to be his son. Vader didn't believe it could be true, but as he got closer and closer, he could feel the familiarity within the Force. He felt that familiarity within Padme back in the day. It was a long-lost feeling, but when it re-emerged from the depths of Vader, he instantaneously knew it had to be the child of Padme Amidala. Vader walked into the room, and with his instant presence, the two that were waiting for him immediately departed. Maul and the Grand Inquisitor left, assuming that they would have a chance to find Kenobi, if he were to come and save Luke. So they naturally waited for him around the throne room, giving Luke and Vader a chance to be alone. Luke looked at Vader as he moved over to his seat and sat down quietly. Luke stepped forward and Vader spoke up.
You are my son? Then you should have been beside me on this throne all along.
What? I can't believe you!
Ezra was in the throne room before the two Jedi arrived, and he was focused on his dark meditation away from his father. Vader had never had an issue with Ezra being inside of the throne room, but he had forgotten Ezra was in there. The thrill of trying to kill Kenobi and the possibility of finding his real son was all the more distracting to him, and he just didn't realize that Ezra was still in the room. Ezra, without giving Luke a chance, speared his lightsaber through Luke's back as he whipped his lightsaber back with the Force as he sheathed it, watching Vader's tone change as his recently discovered son fell lifelessly to the ground. Ezra looked at Vader with rage in his eyes and blood boiling under his skin.
How dare you?
How dare you! I trusted you! I believed you were my father! We took over the galaxy together and you were ready to throw me away for who? A nobody?
That was my son.
Was. What about who is?
He is dead to me.
Then my father is too.
Vader ignited his lightsaber as he stepped forward, heavy steps under his feet. Ezra moved delicately. He had sparred with Vader before, but more importantly, he knew how to beat the Dark Lord as Vader swung heavily down. Vader was much more experienced, and his strikes would be heavy and powerful. They would be able to dismantle any defense that Ezra had against him, but so many years of being under Vader's training, he had to be ready. Moving under a heavy blade as Ezra matched every move his former father made. Tears welted in his eyes as he bounced around, swinging delicately back and forth, allowing the dark side to be his ally, rather than blindly rage him like it was his father, Vader. Darth Vader swung ferociously, cutting through the floor panels and the walls around him as he tried to get closer and closer to Ezra and kill his former son. The duel between adopted father and adopted son cascaded as crimson lit the room, and the sounds of blades caught the attention of Maul and the Grand Inquisitor. When they looked in the room, they saw Vader and Ezra dueling with one another. Neither Maul or the Grand Inquisitor stepped forward. Instead, they both turned around and left the room, awaiting to see who would become victorious of the two. Of course, the victory could be Vader, or it could be Ezra at this point. They didn't want themselves to cement themselves to a losing side. It was a smart decision by them. The rage of Vader's strikes would put fear into anyone's heart, so they avoided the situation as best as they could. Inside of the room, Vader swung heavier and heavier. Ezra was on the back pedal, and on the verge of being killed by Vader. Ezra tumbled down as Vader prepared to end the life of Ezra Bridger. And then Ezra remembered a tactic used by Kenobi, the same one from when Ezra was just a boy. He kicked his foot forward as it slammed into Vader's chest plate, knocking him back. Ezra flipped backwards as he faced down Vader, changing into a more aggressive lightsaber form. Ezra didn't want to let Vader feel like he could just steal the advantage from him, so he pressed forward, clashing blades as the two danced back and forth. Their entire bond, their relationship, their equivalence to father and son died with the death of each other. Each of them focusing on their strengths as Ezra kicked Vader in the chest again, knocking his former master backwards. Vader swung heavily forward as Ezra moved under it, dragging his blade across Vader's torso, destroying the metallic chest piece. Ezra turned around as Vader steadied himself with fragile breathing. His rage boiled from within as he swung at Ezra again, who was quick to snag Vader on the back as his suit as a quick sidestep to the side caught Vader off guard. Vader tumbled to the ground as Ezra stood quietly on the other side of his former father. He looked down as he watched Vader struggle. Ezra bit his lip, trying to hide tears from his eyes. He never wanted it to come like this. He loved Vader, truly like a father. But this visceral betrayal meant that Ezra couldn't trust anyone. He scrunched his face, repressing the emotions and the words he wished he could say to Vader. But he knew that if Vader truly did love him, then he would understand how much he really did hurt him by doing what he did. The ability to so easily betray someone you held so close was the most hurtful thing Ezra had happened to him since his parents were killed. Ezra regained focus as Vader staggered to his feet. His breathing was fragile and weak. He stepped back and forth, trying to claim his footing again, but he struggled. Ezra looked into the eyes of the frightened man behind the mask, as he gritted his teeth and shed a single tear for the man he once loved like a father. Vader swung forward, trying to hit Ezra, seeing the emotion flowing through Ezra's eyes, but Ezra was too quick to reciprocate, as he sidestepped and plunged his lightsaber into Vader's chest. A moment later, he whipped it out, and swung the blade around as it cut through Vader's throat, dropping the Sith Lord to the floor. Ezra, instead of being like a true Sith, fell to his knees, and held Vader's hands without saying a word, as the final sound of the struggling breath of the Dark Lord left an empty echo in the throne room. Ezra's eyes were filled with tears, as they fell down into Vader's scarred suit. The burns left by the lightsaber ate through the tears as they fell onto Vader's suit. Ezra stood up from his knees as he looked at Vader's lightsaber. He brought it over to the throne room and sat down. Holding the lightsaber under heavy shoulders, he looked up as his hair covered his eyes and the yellow tint that sat within them. He was a Sith, but the pain of this, it haunted him, it ate at him, and he couldn't bear it. Ezra stood back up and walked over to the corpse of Vader. He removed the helmet of Vader. Part of Ezra wanted to hate Vader and never think of him again, while the rest of him wanted to remember the man who took him in and trained him in the ways of the Force, without ever having the need to do so. There was no place for Ezra in this story. He never should have been a part of anything. He should have just been an imperial agent, retired from the military, settled down, and just lived a normal life. But because of Vader, he had the shot at becoming something more. Ezra looked into the soulless eyes of Vader as he lifted the body with the Force and dropped him down into the chasm in the room. Ezra turned around as tears trailed him back to his seat. He sat down quietly and regained his composure, awaiting for someone to return to find him as a new Emperor of the Galaxy, the man who killed Vader and helped kill Sidious. Ezra sat quietly, thinking about all that had just occurred. Then the door opened, and it was the Grand Inquisitor. Ezra grinned. He sat back as the Grand Inquisitor got closer and closer to the throne he sat at. When the Grand Inquisitor was within listening range, Ezra spoke up.
Grand Inquisitor, we will instate a new empire in our name. Are you with me?
I will serve by your side. We will establish a new legacy of power.
With Maul and the Grand Inquisitor staying loyal to Ezra, the Sith would establish a new legacy of power. While this new power would never be as fragile as the Inquisitors, with Maul and the Grand Inquisitors as partners, not masters or apprentices, they would raise a new power of evil. Maul wouldn't struggle to find power, as he, Ezra, and the Grand Inquisitor all found each other as equals. While it was clearly apparent that at the moment Ezra was most powerful, the Sith would find Leia to be Force-sensitive, but because she was unrelenting and fiercely against the Empire, and against evil, she would be executed without mercy. With the Sith in control of the Empire, there would be no one able to stop their pursuit of ultimate power in the galaxy. The Jedi would die with Yoda's natural death, and the legacy of the Sith would remain eternal. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is our story. Again, special thanks to George Stewart, Benjamin Wells, Jay Hoffman, Warpigman38, Icy Raptor, Gort, and Chancellor Sanders for supporting the channel. Let's do 2,000 likes on this video so that we can see what if Quinlan Vos trained Anakin Skywalker. If you want to see a what if, let me know down below. I read off the comments about doing 2 crossovers. Check out the Twitch community, Discord, and Patreon if you want to support me in other ways. And if you want to learn how to be a part of our giveaway, go down below. There's a pinned comment. On that pinned comment is a doc link. You click on the doc, you go to the doc, you write your name. I'll be giving away one of these Sideshow collectibles if we hit 35,000 subscribers by July 31st at 11:59 p.m. We got 3 days to do it, so I believe we can do it. I think we can do it. If we can do that, I think we can do it. Let's do it. If not, then I'll do another giveaway for 50,000 subscribers. Regardless, let's talk about our story here because that is what we're here to talk about. I'm really happy with how the story turned out. I think the story was interesting, to say the least. To say the very least, the story was interesting. And I wanted to set up a father and son bond between Vader and Ezra, because they both lost somebody, right? Ezra lost his parents, and obviously Vader lost his family. He lost Padme and what he would assume would be his only child. Of course, no one knew that there were 2 children. That was a surprise. No one knew. It was just a surprise that she was having twins. So for Anakin, for Vader at least, it would be like reclaiming that long-lost child. He would be able to be like, oh, well, I can fill that hole in my heart with this being. And whether that's healthy or not, that's what happened. And I honestly wanted to build this father-son relationship between the 2 of them, and I really wanted them to feel like a father and son. But that would never last, because Vader's real children were born. Vader's real children existed in the galaxy. It just was a matter of finding them. And I think the moment that they would be found, Vader would change on Ezra in an instant. I don't think he would wait around and be like, well, I can keep both of them. It's like, no, this is my real son, and I want my real son. If I wanted a fake son, I would keep Ezra, but I want a real son. And I think for Vader, I think he would have no issue just throwing Ezra away. And I wanted to set it up where Ezra was in the room, and Vader didn't know. He just wasn't paying attention, and he just didn't pick up on the fact that Ezra was there. Killing Luke was something that I obviously figured would make a couple of you upset, and then killing Vader, and then killing Leia. Yeah, I know. But that's just how the story went. You know, I wanted the story to be tragic, and it just happened to come out that way. Actually, I didn't even want it to be that way. I just wanted to see where it went. It was very easy for me to set it up as a Vader story, as a Vader win story, as a feel-good story for Vader, but that just didn't feel natural in this story. I think Ezra, as we've seen in Rebels, with 1 solid year, and he was trained for 2 years, but with 1 solid year under training, he became extremely powerful. The change between Season 2 and Season 3 of Rebels is insane. Ezra grows into an incredible power. So, I mean, obviously part of that is help with the Sith holocron, but if he's literally learning Sith holocron information, he's being trained by Vader, this guy's gonna be powerful. And I think he would have enough power to beat Vader, especially a Vader that just fought Obi-Wan, who's going to be tired from fighting Obi-Wan, and has just found out all this revealing information. So, I think Vader would be angry, and I think he would be off balance because of the anger. I don't think he'd be as balanced with his anger. Well, I think in this situation, Ezra would be a little bit more composed, because he's been a dark side user since he was 7. It's kind of like Palpatine in a way. Palpatine was very powerful because he started learning the dark side of the Force at a very young age, not like as an infant, but at a young age. And I think that's going to be the same kind of reaction we have here. I think we have a very powerful Force user in Ezra Bridger. So I hope you all enjoyed this. I know Ezra's not everyone's favorite character, but it was kind of like a Starkiller story in a way. In a way, Starkiller was Ezra, and Ezra was Starkiller, and in a way that, you know, the case was that instead of Starkiller being killed and falling into the natural canon, Ezra reestablishes his own canon. And I thought it was interesting, so I hope you all enjoyed this. If you did, leave a like down below, subscribe, go for 50,000 subscribers. Anyways, I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, may the Force be with you.